Welcome back, and here we are again, this time back with analgesics, and we're talking about strong analgesics. Okay, so now we're starting to look at this level 2 and 3 in terms of drugs. So opioids for mild to moderate pain and opioids for moderate to severe pain. So let's get started. In terms of strong analgesics, what we are concentrating on for the IB in our option is looking at opiates. So in this, essentially we're using opiates as a case study to look at drugs that cross the blood-brain barrier. So what that means for their structure and solubility. The idea that opiates are natural narcotics, okay, and what that means for their definition. So being able to define narcotics. Where they're derived from, so morphine and codeine being used as strong analgesics, and how they work, the medical use and addictive properties of these compounds, explanation of the synthesis of these compounds, and why they're used. Okay, also looking at comparing the structures, so that page 38 and 39 of our data booklet, and being able to identify those key structural features and how they're similar and how they're different. The advantages and disadvantages of using morphine and its derivatives as strong analgesics. The discussions of side effects and addiction, which is a key problem with these compounds, and explaining the increased potency of diamorphine or heroin compared to morphine, and this of course again being based on its structure and solubility. As we've seen with this option already, a lot of the things that we're talking about come back to structure and bonding, and therefore being able to explain those things in terms of solubility and how they access receptor sites. So the strong analgesics we're looking at are opiates. Morphine and codeine are both derived from the immature seed pod of the opium. So this is the seed pod here, and we were having a discussion in class the other day about whether it had flowered or not, and this is the immature seed pod. So it is before the flower has opened and been fertilized and starts to go to seed. It's when the seed pod is green and of particular species of poppies, which are, as you'd expect, highly regulated. Australia has quite a growing presence in terms of opium production for medicinal purposes. Previously, most of our opium and medicinal opiate-based drugs, so morphine and codeine, have been produced in Tasmania. There are a couple of farms with the regulations and security to be able to produce it there. I was at a conference recently and they said that we have there's a farm in Victoria that's just been certified as well. So this is an industry that will be growing at home here in Victoria as well. As you can expect, high security and highly regulated, need all kinds of permits and so forth to be able to grow opium poppies. So opiate refers to a class of compounds, and all these compounds exhibit similar effects to morphine in terms of their mode of action and how they work. They are generally classified according to 3 categories. That is, they are naturally occurring, so they're derived from the poppy. They are semi-synthetic, which means we take this sap of the poppy and then make minor alterations to it, or completely synthetic. Okay, so semi-synthetic is where we take a precursor and then that is derived naturally and then adjust it by using different chemical treatments. Fully synthetic is where we start from scratch and build the molecule. Okay, so as we mentioned, opiates are naturally occurring narcotics, and these are basically drugs that produce a euphoric sensation, that feeling of peace and tranquility. So calming, that sense of euphoria. Okay, this is because of the way that they interact with receptors in the brain. All opiates are considered to be narcotics. They all, to some extent, have that calming and tranquil euphoric sensation because of where they act in the brain. So as we mentioned previously with our non-steroidal anti-inflammatories such as aspirin, they work at the site of the pain, interrupting the pain signals from the nociceptors and sending that signal to the brain. Our opiates, however, are going to act on opioid receptors in the brain cells. Okay, so usually pain will come up, trigger these opioid receptors, and the signal is transferred. However, when we use opiates or strong analgesics, opiates, they bind into the receptor, blocking the transmission of that pain signal from cell to cell. And this is happening in the brain, not at the site of the pain. So it's blocking transmission of the pain signals by binding of the drug to the opioid pain receptors in the brain. If we have a look, what this usually means is these neurotransmitters that pass on the signals, the pain signals, okay, these are linked to endorphin release. Okay, so endorphins are naturally the brain's natural painkillers, and they're released by a pituitary gland, and they block pain perception. So our perception of pain, they're not stopping the pain from happening, but they are stopping our brain from perceiving it as pain. So endorphins are naturally released and bind with the opiate receptors in our brain, okay? And then substance P is a neurotransmitter. Substance P is released if we don't have endorphins. So what we're getting is the endorphins act, they bind to the opiate receptor and they block the release of substance P. So now we have no pain signal being passed on. The signal can't be carried through, so we get no pain signal. Opiates are binding to exactly these same receptors. So it's not the natural endorphins that are actually happening. Now we have our drug molecules that actually come in and bind to these same receptors. So they have a very similar effect on our brain as what endorphins do, which is part of the problem that we have with them in terms of that narcotic effect and how that reacts in our brain and the way that we tend to behave on them. If we compare this methencephalin here is a natural endorphin. It's a peptide-based natural endorphin made by our body, and we've talked about these amide groups being quite common in natural substances. But if we have a look here, this particular group here is very similar to the fused ring structure and the sort of shape that we see on the edge of morphine shown here. So you can picture that this part of the molecule is going to bind into a very similar shape as what this part of this molecule would. This is going to hang out. This is going to hang out here. Okay, and we can adjust these for solubility. But this framework of the OH, this part of the benzene ring, and then this sort of V-shaped carbon here to a nitrogen, this is all exactly the same shape as what we see on the natural endorphins, which is why they're able to bind into the same receptor, that lock and key kind of mechanism. So one of the biggest problems is because morphine and other opiates act in the brain, we've talked about how we can increase bioavailability by increasing water solubility into our blood, but these need to actually get into our brain. And the brain has what we call a blood-brain barrier, and it's designed to protect our brain and really restricts the transport of substances in and out. Okay, so this membrane is mostly made of lipids. So a lot of what's transported in our blood, we've talked about being water soluble. So now we have this fat layer that protects pretty much large portions of what goes from the water soluble part of our body into our brain, which has a lot more fatty tissue. Molecules that need to cross this blood-brain barrier need to be able to be transported in the blood, but also have non-polar characteristics that will allow them to transfer through this fatty layer, which is non-polar. Okay, so the effectiveness of strong analgesics is basically going to be dependent on the balance of aqueous solubility to be carried around in our blood, and that lipid solubility in order to be able to cross into the brain and get across the blood-brain barrier. If they're too charged, and we've talked about delivering aspirin and things like that as lysine salts or sodium salts, if they're salts or they're too charged, they're not going to cross across the blood-brain barrier. So in this case, we want to use hydroxyls and groups that won't become charged but provide some water solubility in combination with other groups that perhaps have less water solubility. So if we look at these, the three main opiates that we need to know in particular and in detail are codeine, morphine, and diamorphine. We need to be able to identify the functional groups, which we've had a bit of practice at lately. So looking at codeine in terms of the two ethers that we have here in blue, the arene being our benzene, and what we really should be calling our benzene functional groups, the 1-hydroxyl in pink, and then the tertiary amine here on this ring here. This ether and tertiary amine are consistent across all three of our opiates. Okay, so this ether and tertiary amine is consistent across all three of the opiates that we need to look at. The area that it changes is where this hydroxyl and this ether is. Okay, in the case of a codeine, we have hydroxyl and ether, morphine, 2 hydroxyls, and then in diamorphine, those hydroxyls have been actually converted into esters, and that's done synthetically. That's done in a lab. We don't find that molecule naturally with those 2 esters on them. So codeine is about 4.5% of our raw opium. But usually we will convert codeine from morphine. So we will do this methoxy ether preparation here and convert the hydroxyl into one of these. So codeine, for the most part, while we can obtain it naturally, is a semi-synthetic. We do an extra step to it. Morphine is only present in raw opium at about 10%, but it is purely extracted from opium. Heroin, very, very small amounts found in opium, but usually, again, we react in this in the lab from morphine into diamorphine. So if you can imagine only 0.5% of codeine, it's even less of that for diamorphine. So codeine is typically used in, you might have seen Panadeine or Panadeine Forte. It's used when we have stronger pain that needs to be managed, but usually still self-administered. Okay, and is also present in cough medications to repress cough. It can also be used in the short-term treatment of diarrhea because one of the other effects of opiates, so we've got side effects of opiates. One is to depress the respiratory system, okay, to suppress that cough reflex. One of the others is it causes constipation. So sometimes these low-level opiates are used to treat diarrhea and things like that in patients. Morphine is typically used in severe pain and advanced cancer where we have chronic pain situations. This is largely because it needs to be monitored. It can be habit forming, okay, that being that it has addictive properties, okay, leading to dependence, and needs to be regulated by a medical professional because of the risk of dependence. Diamorphine has a high risk of dependence and a very strong narcotic effect, okay, but it comes with it gets tolerance quite quickly, and also has quite severe withdrawal symptoms and various other problems associated with that. Okay. So we have talked about the main functional groups and key alterations quite a bit, okay? So you just need to be aware that both codeine and diamorphine are typically made from morphine and therefore are considered to be semi-synthetic. Heroin structure or diamorphine structure is only slightly different from morphine, But these structural differences, the presence of these esters, is what accounts for its increased potency and associated other effects. Okay, let's have a look. So codeine is pretty much our most common one that is readily available. We get this via a process called methylation, where we are adding a methyl onto our hydroxyl and forming the methoxy ether. Okay, so this is known as methylation. Esterification, which we've seen before, is used to add the ester group onto the morphine. So you can see here that we have esterified with ethanoic acid. Okay, so heroin is far more potent, it's much stronger. Okay, codeine is only 10% as effective as morphine, but is generally non-addictive, so we can deliver it orally. Heroin, however, is far more potent than morphine and is highly addictive and leads to high levels of tolerance. So this is our increasing strength as an analgesic here, as well as increasing narcotic effects and increasing side effects. We're going to build these structures and have a bit of a practice with them. So I'm just going to skip over this now, and we will do this the next time I see you in class. Okay, so this is just a bit of an idea of World Health Organization of guidelines for pain management, and we're going to wrap this up very shortly. But essentially there's a 3-step analgesic ladder, and this is those steps we've been using at the beginning of each video. Essentially it provides guidelines for the prescription of narcotics and pain management. So for each one, they attempt to treat the pain. If the pain persists or increases, it goes up another step on the ladder until eventually we get to level 3, where we have strong opioids being prescribed for severe pain, okay, in a hope of controlling people's pain. So, of course, we have talked about side effects quite a lot. So strong analgesics have a number of side effects, which is a reason why most of them are administered under medical supervision. Okay, so basically, pretty much most of these are considered to be adverse side effects, with only a small number considered for therapeutic use. So remember, side effects can often sometimes be used for other therapeutic processes. The common side effects are constipation, suppression of cough reflex, constriction of the pupil in the eye, narcotic effects, including addiction, and we have buildup of tolerance and respiratory depression. So if a person has too much morphine, they have respiratory depression, they have a morphine overdose, basically their lungs shut down and they die because they're not breathing. Okay, so this is one of the reasons it needs to be monitored quite carefully. Codeine is, because of this, can be used in quite low levels to suppress a cough. This basically summarizes your advantages and disadvantages of opiate use. Okay, so you should replicate this in your notes so that you are able to talk about the advantages and disadvantages. When we're talking about opiates, we're talking about a painkiller that's about 50 times as potent as aspirin. Okay, so we're talking something that deals with not I just have a bad headache, but when we're talking chronic pain, pain after surgery, pain associated with cancer, very extreme cases of rheumatoid arthritis or back injury or things like that, where people are suffering with high levels of pain and aren't able to manage them in any other way. As research goes forward, we're learning a lot more about pain management, and hopefully, and more we're being able to provide solutions to pain without opiates, but it is one of our largest considerations for building tolerance and addiction based on opiate drugs is common due to chronic long-term pain. Okay, so that's it for our opiates. That summarizes opiates and brings us to the end of analgesics. Hopefully you are able to compare mild analgesics and strong analgesics and are reviewing those functional groups so that we can identify the differences in our structures. So good luck with putting all this together, and I will see you in class.